Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the final plenary session of this April APS meeting. And we're delighted to introduce a session on advancing an inclusive community in science. We have three excellent talks, each of which will be 30 minutes talk followed by 6 minutes questions. I'd like to remind everybody to please enter questions in the Q&A tab of the chat box. And if you want to chat with other attendees at the meeting at this session, please use the chat tab of the chat box. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce the first speaker, who is Brian Nord, and will discuss addressing systematic oppression in physics from root causes to strategic action. So let me stop sharing and take it away, please.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you to the organizers of this session and to my fellow speakers for sharing this space and time. It's my honor to open the session. I also want to thank everyone in attendance here for their energy and their time. We are still in the midst of a pandemic that is affecting peoples across the world in a variety of ways, disparate access to effective vaccine and healthcare across the world. And while measurable progress is being made in some places in the world with respect to vaccination, not all continents, nations, and peoples are as fortunate as many of us in the US. Indeed, not all communities within the US are as equally fortunate. In particular, Black and Brown and Indigenous peoples are lacking equitable access to COVID vaccination and related healthcare. Additionally, in this and in very recent moments, we are reminded again, as if not continuously, of the second-class status of Black people in America. Right now, we're working through and dealing with the recent murders by police of Black men and boys, of the many murders of Black, queer, and trans folk this year, and thus we witness the occupation of Black and brown lives. This is something that my fellow Black colleagues and I don't get to leave behind when we go to work. We often discuss how to cope, how to do work, how to think under these threats and acts of violence by the state and under, I'll say, my palls of skepticism of America holding violent and murdering police to account. So in particular to my Black and brown fam and other fam of color, I thank you for using part of your energy and time for this conversation. And so I speak for myself, but I think in unison with many others that this oppression and other modes that we feel daily are past due for change. So that's what I'd like to talk about today. I'd like to talk about what change looks like and who has the power to create it. So I think many of us have heard this refrain that change takes time, or that there already has been change and we should continue to be patient in the midst of gradualism, in the clutches of gradualism. But I think when someone says this, an important question I ask is, whose clock are we using? So first I want to talk about how long did we wait when people say that change takes time? Let's try to understand what's happened under the clocks of other peoples. So a lot of us have seen the evidence before the data for why change is needed, but maybe it bears repeating, even if briefly. The total number of bachelor's degrees in physics has doubled, according to the AIP Team Up report, since 2000. But the percentage of bachelor's earned by Black students has merely fluctuated over that same period of time, down 1.5% and then up 1.5%. And actually it's been decreasing since 2016. What about faculty? While Black people make up 12.7% of the US, we are, as of 2012, we were merely 2% of physics faculty. As an example, at Fermilab, as far as I know, there have only been 2 tenured Black scientists, and they've both been men. The first one retired in 2019, which was just a year before I was tenured as the second Black physics faculty. So over 50 or 60 years, national labs are maybe just replacing us once a generation. And so I think it's important to ask, has your department ever had a Black professor, postdoc, or grad student? Actually, many haven't. What about Indigenous bachelors? Again, mere fluctuations over the last 20 years, at least this plot from AIP report in 2013 shows this. And total of 26 in 2013. So these fluctuations are numbers per 1,000 degrees awarded. So incredibly small numbers. Our fam in the LGBTQ plus community still feels incredibly uncomfortable, finds that policies are uneven or lacking, and that they're even expected to often not be too gay in their work environments. So we've been waiting. Our institutions, our ecosystems, our cultures have had decades, at least, to find ways to change and evolve. And I think one important reason, if not one large set of reasons, that we have not seen more reasonable, more just evolution is because of the growth of something that I would call big diversity, or the equity diversity industrial complex, which I think has left us with many empty promises. So big diversity is now, I think, a safe space for institutions. There are terms that help make people feel comfortable, equity, diversity, inclusion, but they are not always used in the meanings in which many of us hope they would be used, in terms of justice, in terms of dignity. We find a lot of climate surveys happening in institutions, seminars, trainings, awards for having been an ally. We find that people talk about productivity and the business case for diversity before they talk about the humanity. We talk about needing an inclusive environment for everyone, which sort of flies a bit in the face of the idea of equity. And we also find that big diversity or diversity exercises are often the purview of the human resources departments, which are not always staffed by people that have training in achieving justice in our communities. So as I go through a bit more of the evidence for the issues with big diversity, I would ask the question, or I would ask you to ask the question, what is missing from this list? So it's pretty clear that big diversity confuses symptoms and roots of causes of injustice. Rarely is racism or white supremacy discussed in seminars, in training. Terms are often misused. So instead of diversity meaning cultural, ethnic, racial diversity, it's often talked about as diversity of thought. I would also ask, what does the term inclusion really mean in your community? Does it mean building community around justice, or does it mean assimilation of people who are otherwise othered? Are there actual mechanisms for accountability discussed with big diversity, or is it just asking individuals to do their part? In an article last year by Sophia Chen in Wired, they discussed how the research from decades of research in social science and psychology shows that training doesn't really work. In a lot of cases, it causes backlash against majority groups like white men, and it doesn't impact often the recruitment of Black scientists, and more often, it actually just affects the reputation of the organization that conducts the institution that has the training. As Professor Prescott Weinstein points out in Diversity is a Dangerous Setup and in the Diversity Racket, things like implicit bias science are unproven. They actually distract from other individual behaviors like explicit bias and harassment, and they distract from systemic mechanisms. I don't know if people watch This Week Tonight, but there's an interesting episode on plastics in which John Oliver shows that companies supported in the 70s and 80s, municipal recycling programs because it put the onus on individuals instead of on the system. It made people feel like it was just their responsibility to put that right plastic in the bin. And I think this is the same thing that we see with big diversity. While we do need to hold individuals to account, big diversity puts the onus on individuals without addressing systemic mechanisms. By asking people to attend seminars and go to trainings, but not create new policies that actually hold people or the systems itself to account with respect to equity and justice, it refocuses on, or refuses to focus on the system. If you build a community in which justice is the expectation, then it makes it easier. And by build community, I mean policies included. It makes it easier for people to do the right thing. If you don't have those, if you don't have that community, if you don't have the expectations in place, why would we expect people to start doing the right thing, no matter how many seminars we throw at them? So what if we actually really just hired lots of Black, Indigenous, and LGBTQ plus scientists? What if we held people accountable through, say, withholding their funding through funding agencies for their explicitly negative racist behavior? What if we paid people at our institutions for doing the work that relates to racial justice? I don't know about your institutions, but I've found where I've been, there are not enough task codes that actually give people the hours to do this work, so they're meant to do it in their spare time. Or you see students and postdocs, unfunded, spending their precious hours also doing this work. And that often includes marginalized groups just trying to fight for their own safety and freedom. So we've seen big diversity do its thing through our institutions for the last several years. So how much longer must we wait? And I think this depends on how we choose to see the systems, the power structures and dynamics that we work in. And I think it depends on how we choose to see the pressure that we can wield against the system or within the system. So from national labs to departments, I think it's a common pattern or a common structure to have hierarchies of decision-making. These vertical decision-making structures have mostly a one-directional upward information flow from large numbers of people, typically considered at the bottom of the power structure, to the top, where the information and power is concentrated. These single points of responsibility within the structure create bottlenecks for information and decision-making. And community members are often asked to use their energy to only push on the layer above. So you can see in this schematic, in this scheme, maybe how change is harder to make happen. Working strictly within the prescribed rules of these systems severely limits our options for problem solving and action. I think what a lot of us have experienced is a typical procedure for a response from an institution, including the community, that a problem arises, institution forms the committee or the task force, the committee submits a report to management and institutional leads, and then decision rests with one or just a few people. This, and then rinse and repeat every time there is a problem. This makes it really difficult for the community as a whole to influence final decisions. And I'm not going to say that acting also just outside of this structure is the way to make things happen. I think we actually need to see the whole picture and act within and outside the system. So we need to consider all actors, all people as decision makers, all internal advocates, and all community members. And the rest of the stakeholders also include actually the public, our funding agencies, our peer physicists at other organizations, and the peer heads of organizations. These systems and the individuals within it respond to pressure, not just from below, but also from these other stakeholders, for example, from press and from public comment. And so I think the question becomes, how can we influence all of these stakeholders at the right or at the opportune moment to create the change that we want to see? And I think this is where it makes sense, and this is a good point for us to talk about the other actions that can take place or that we can cause that are outside the system or that sort of interleave within and without the systems and the institutions. So I want to go through a few examples in recent memory, particularly over the last year, of, I won't call them organizations, but I'll call them groups of people who have decided to do some things that are maybe, that are not what we typically see acting within organizations. And they're not, but they're not also, I also want to be careful here or be clear. I think these are groups of people who are working to learn from decades of activist and social change, theory of change, perspectives and strategies, working to use those tactics to see what can be caused to change, what can be changed at different cadences and at different speeds within our institutions. So though we came together a few years ago with writing a letter about sexual harassment and assault in physics, Particles for Justice took on another action last June in concert with Shutdown STEM to call people to halt action, halt science for a day, to take time to think about, to learn about, to take their own action, asking not the Black and brown people to do work for just a day to see if we can liberate Black lives within physics. This garnered thousands of signatories and participants in the strike day of action. I still hear people talking about it, still talking about what they've discussed during those times, what plans they've made. It achieved or received international coverage and pointed to and highlighted racism in academia for a time. The Change Now group at Fermilab, which is led by postdocs and researchers at Fermilab, created 7 researched calls to action in a 16-page dossier that we gave to Fermilab leadership and management and said, this is, in our experience and our expertise and the work that we've been doing for the last decade, this is what we need. This is what we think needs to happen now to see things change even on longer timescales. We see that the results of this are still pending. The Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity group in Astronomy at the University of Chicago is a collective of postdocs and grad students that formed in 2017 to work for justice in astronomy, and then reignited or refocused their efforts on creating demands and working groups to support Black astronomers and physicists at UChicago. Their work is still underway. They operate at the intersection of the institution and as an external collective. The Physics and Astronomy Anti-Racism Coalition is a group of postdocs and grad students at institutions across the country. They are a support network for each other and support network in terms of planning and in terms of discussing issues within their community. Recently formed, the Society of Indigenous Physicists is a group of people who are interconnected through paths and fields of physics, astronomy, and planetary sciences. Going further afield, away from strictly identity-based or strictly justice-based organizations, my colleagues and I in 2017, seeing the landscape of inequities amongst early career scientists and others in our science collaborations, and seeing how the crunch of needing to have constant scientific productivity in our institutions and in science collaborations like in high energy physics really kind of broke down the lives and communities of people, especially early career scientists, especially marginalized groups. we formed the Deep Skies Lab, which is instead of being focused on scientific results and productivity, we were focused on learning methods in artificial intelligence and astronomy. And before that, we're focused on human first, issues of being a human first in a collaboration. We're transnational, cross-institutional. We have horizontal decision-making. I think the power of collectives includes agile action. All the groups that I just mentioned are, they don't have hierarchical, strictly hierarchical decision-making. It's much more horizontal. This distributes responsibility and reduces single point bottlenecks for making decisions and for taking action. Their purposes can be agile as well. They can take up action when external events require it, or internal events. And between actions, they provide support to groups, to the groups that they are made of. The power of collectives is also in trust, I think. As we educate ourselves on the history and mechanisms of activist strategy, we realize that we have to build coalition amongst ourselves and with those who would realize the power of their allyship. And we do learn to hold each other accountable with compassion. Related are two organizations or two efforts that I've also seen take hold in small but growing sectors of physics. This is the APS IDEA group, which focuses on theories of change and second order features of culture and community, not first order change, like what we've seen through big diversity. And also departmental action teams, which are externally facilitated groups of faculty, students, and staff in departments that share leadership and responsibility. What I see in collectives and what I see in these new efforts for reform from within is a greater sense of mutual respect amongst all of the community members. This is not something that I think we see frequently within our, especially vertically hierarchically oriented institutions. And I think that this is one of the critical things that is missing from efforts to make change in our institutions. Lack of shared leadership and a lack of trust. So then how long can we wait when lives, cultures, and freedoms are in peril? So why, I don't think that we can keep saying we need diversity so that we can do better science, so that we can have better ideas. We haven't been able to say that, but we've been saying it for some time, but we really need to stop saying that. But if we want other motivation or related motivation to doing it because it's the right thing to do, then I think we should look at what is being taken from all of us, though in particular marginalized groups, when we don't have a greater urgency amongst all of us. While the sky is for all of us, sacred ground has been and is being stolen. Native Hawaiians and their Mauna Kea is sacred ground, particularly for the Kanaka Maoli people. However, the TMT Corporation and affiliated universities are building a telescope without acknowledgement of Native Hawaiians' land and cultural sovereignty. The land is being stolen to gather data for us. The Quilombola people of Alcantara are descendants of enslaved peoples, and their space, the Alcantara, is home to thousands of them. It is land at the equator, which makes it easy to launch rockets. The nation of Brazil wants to sell launch opportunities to countries around the world, including the United States, who recently entered into an agreement in 2019, entered into another agreement with Brazil to launch there. This land is being stolen from Quilombola to sell space to rich countries. Starlink is a satellite internet company owned by Elon Musk that has now launched thousands of satellites into Earth's orbit, leaving streaks in astronomical images. Without regulation, Starlink has few, if any, restrictions and can launch these satellites at will. They are stealing the sky from everyone, from the future of everyone, under the auspices of sharing internet. We all have data. There's another piece to this. We all have data. And it is being used against us. So in the age of AI, let's think about surveillance and you. So they collect our data with and without our consent. We gave away, without really thinking about it, knowing about it, in the 2000s, in the 90s and 2000s, we gave away our data for free email. Today, you can buy a number of devices from Amazon that provide surveillance tools, that provide surveillance on almost any part of you. So a pod, glasses, earbuds, a ring, all of these things hold Alexa in it and are always listening to you. Clearview Ai is a company that came about a couple of years ago, and they scraped your social media, violating the terms of service. They trained a deep learning neural network, and then they sold the results of that network for surveillance purposes to law enforcement. They and others, with all of this information that they're gathering from us, build models with biased training sets. So like this one is a facial recognition benchmark training set, and it's mostly composed of men and white faces. And then with these neural networks, they watch us wherever we go, so that they can try to identify us in different spaces, on sidewalks, in airports, and in schools. And then after they've identified us, they claim to measure things about us. They claim to detect things about who we are, our emotions, our sexuality, our gender, our race and ethnicity. And then they use this information about us and all these correlations to try to tell us what to buy, what to watch, where to go, who to date, who gets healthcare, even though we know that these healthcare prediction algorithms are biased against Black people, or who is incarcerated, even though we know that these algorithms put people in jail, they inequitably put Black people in jail. So in the cycle of surveillance, it affects mostly Black and brown people and others who are marginalized, but it's going to, and it already is, affecting all of us. But collective action has been shown to actually curb the usage of some of these tools. At least facial recognition in at least 13 cities have banned facial recognition due to collective action. On the other side of data, genomics and data sovereignty, thinking about indigenous communities and populations that give of their DNA to healthcare companies, to healthcare providers, without a guarantee of benefiting from research, while pharmaceutical companies have almost unfettered access, and while health markets are being linked to DNA and genomes, there is yet no agreed upon process to acknowledge or return data sovereignty to these communities. Though people like Keolu Fox are imagining new ideas and new worlds of equitable benefit sharing that brings some of that sovereignty and profit back to indigenous communities. And I think, and I want to pause here and highlight the imagination there of Professor Fox, and the imagination that I think we need to see in our communities, in our physics community, amongst our fellow physicists, in imagining new ways of seeing power structures and imagining new ways of changing the system, because we can't keep going with first order changes. We need to think about how we can use the entire the entire web of influence to accelerate change. Otherwise, we're going to be waiting until I retire to hire or to promote another tenured scientist at places like Fermilab.
Excuse me, Ryan, you've got 2 minutes.
Thank you. And so I would ask, like, what imagination, what creativity would you call on yourself if there were a present and impending cataclysm that threatened the existence of your people, say climate change? What if I just simply changed that context briefly? What if instead it was white supremacy? What would you do to liberate your people? So how long did we wait? How long can we wait? How long will we wait? I think one of the takeaways that I hope people have here is to engage in other modes of action that are not just within the systems, not just the modes of action that have been presented to you by the system. And I hope that you will, I'll paraphrase Angela Davis in that all of these issues, and this is why I talked about data privacy, data rights, algorithmic accountability, data sovereignty. All of these issues that go beyond borders. They're transnational, they're trans identity. They're amongst all different kinds of identity and cultures. These systems of oppression are affecting all of us, whether you see it or not, and they will continue to affect all of us more in the future. I guess I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks very much. That was great. So people have been typing questions into the Q&A box. I'd like to encourage people to keep on asking questions and to vote on the ones that are there. One of the top ranked questions is, it seems like most EDI efforts are spearheaded by young physicists, which causes stress and takes away from their research career time. How to get senior physicists and leaders to work on this instead of just giving lip service to agreeing it's important. And there was a related question, what is the best appropriate way to take into account a candidate's marginalized identity in hiring, and do you have strategies for getting older faculty on board with new ways of thinking?
I might ask you to repeat the second one, but also I'll try to take the first one first. So I've looked into it a little bit. I'm not an expert in it, but I really like the departmental action team procedure. I think it's dat-project.com or .org. You can look it up there. This is a methodology that people have developed that recognizes the experiences, roles, and expertise of all the different stakeholders within a department, and does provide, I believe it provides some compensation, particularly for earlier career folks who are wanting to do this work. So I think part of it is thinking about building community around this effort and realizing that it's everyone's responsibility and that everyone brings something, not everyone exactly, but people from different experiences in a department will bring really different key perspectives. And everyone being compensated appropriately for that work. So I think it's problematic which I see all the time. I think it's really problematic that when there's paternalism amongst later career folks to earlier career folks, and assuming that they haven't had enough experience and that early career folks haven't developed enough expertise. And I think really it's important for us to start listening to the people who are living in the moment and have done the homework with respect to justice and equity, with respect to activists and other kinds of strategic efforts. If we don't listen to them, then that is the key part where we're falling behind. And Julie, could you say what the second question was again?
Sure. Sorry, I tried to merge two questions into one, which was probably not wise. Another later question was, what is the best or most appropriate way to take into account a candidate's marginalized identity in hiring? Do you have strategies for getting older faculty on board with new ways of thinking?
I don't know what the best way is to take into account an individual's marginalized identity. I think that some institutions are, well, one clear way actually is don't assume that your institution is so amazing that, for example, Black people are going to apply for a job there. There are lots of places, and Black people are not a monolith, but there are lots of places that I've heard that lots of Black people are not even interested in applying to, and these are elite places because they know that some of these institutions still operate under mechanisms and modes of, say, apartheid with the communities that they are centered in. And so you can't assume that your institution is so great that anyone wants to be there. You need to do the work to build community with those marginalized groups. When it comes to later career faculty who are maybe not as interested, I think that's a dynamic and moving landscape where we need to think about how any given individual, how to build coalition with any given individual or group of individuals at the right moments. So reaching critical mass in a department or in a community is important to leverage action and leverage whatever power is in that moment to responding to, for example, an external stimulus. And I think people are ready to change at different moments. And so being ready to talk to them and being ready to bring them on board or being ready for them to enter community is important. But also, if they're not ready, we can't wait for everyone to be on board until we try to really push for change. So I hope that gets close to answering that last question. Thanks.
Thanks. And then we've got time for one more question. I'm speaking for the questioner here. In my experience, there's a pervasive view that diversity hires are detrimental to the success of a group. How do we change this perception?
So I think hopefully it's not, I don't think it's nitpicking, but I think language here does matter. Diversity hire is problematic language. And I think that we should be thinking about this, and that's related to how we think about, I think, inclusion typically, which often is assimilation of this unicorn or of this person that is an other into a community. And so I think this goes back to what APS IDEA is thinking about and what some of these other collectives are thinking about, which is second order change, rethinking the values of the culture and the community from the outset, and not thinking about, we're tacking on a person that checks a box for us in these different ways. So I think that's one of the first steps, is to rethink how we view and how we view community and what kind of communities we want to build.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Brian. That was an excellent talk and discussion. So I'd like to go ahead and introduce the next speaker, who is Dara Norman, and will discuss evolving physics to support underrepresented communities. So take it away.
All right, thank you. Let me share my screen. And let me get it into the right mode. All right. Thank you very much. And that was a great talk by Brian, and he touched on a number of points that I also will touch on. I'm in this talk going to talk about evolving physics to support underrepresented communities, and we'll get to the title later, but this talk is really about culture and about cultural change and how we need to change our culture in physics to really support everybody to be the most productive that they can be in the space that they have decided that they want to work. that is physics and astronomy. And so I want to start by pointing out that, in fact, science has a culture, physics has a culture, and like other cultures, we have things like language. We have ways that we, express our thoughts, the equations that we use. We have norms, the things that we expect of other people within that culture, and the ways that we expect them to act, or we recognize they will act. We have traditions. We have things that we do. We take pictures of ourselves when we get together for meetings. We do other things that are not necessarily traditions that other areas of science or other groups have. And I would argue we even have art. We have the ways that we design our experiments. We have the ways that we give our talks. And we also have values. And these are the things that we have deemed important to the field, or things that we have deemed less important to the field. And when I talk about cultural change in this talk, I'm really talking about changing our traditions, our norms, and our values to be more equitable and more inclusive of all of the people who want to do physics in our field. And because culture is not innate, we weren't born knowing what science and physics culture are. It's not innate, it's learned, and it's been learned down through our mentors and generations of physicists. So it can be changed. And I want to talk about the ways that we might think about changing our culture. So by way of outline, I'm going to give you this recipe for what I see as being more inclusive of groups in our field. And it's going to start with a recognition of the problem. And then I'm going to show you that there are a few informal institutional changes that are being made in various spaces by individuals and even by departments and by collaborations. But what I want to argue is that we need formal institutional change in order to actually get to this cultural change. And by formal institutional change, I'm talking about really incentivizing that change with consequences and rewards for moving in the right direction. And in this way, we can really harness the innovation that is untapped within our workforce and within the folks who do physics. We can really use that to promote inclusion in our spaces of research. So let's start with recognition of the problem. Brian already showed a number of statistics, and I am showing them again. I want to point out that there are tiny numbers of minority, underrepresented minority folks who have bachelor's and PhDs in physics, and especially as compared to their presence in the overall population. And I'm focusing on minorities here because this is of ethnic minorities in particular, because this is part of the easiest place to recognize where all these discrepancies are. And so as we make changes to our culture, we'll not only be improving things for these groups, but we're likely to be improving them for everyone, because we'll have a better, a more inclusive, a more welcoming culture. In the bottom slides, which I stole from Lauren Chambers, it points out the overwhelming observation that white men are dominant in physics spaces, despite their relatively lack of dominance in the overall population. And we want to look at this as an actual issue in physics spaces. So Brian talked a little bit about this too. And, if we believe that the intelligence, ability, drive, and interest to succeed in physics in this space, in this research, is distributed amongst the population without regard to race or gender or socioeconomic background, then those numbers that I just showed you are a real problem, right? Why aren't those folks in our spaces? And while Brian argued that we should get away from the practical, some people are not there, and I recognize that. But we really need to think about the fact that until we include everybody who can make a difference in our field, we really are not getting the best scientific output. And if we don't recognize that we need those talented people in our spaces, then we'll be shooting ourselves in the foot by not including them in what we do. And this is why we should care. So in order to move from this, from the recognition of this problem, we really need to look at physics culture and physics thinking. So I mentioned the title of this talk, and when I was asked to give this talk, a title was suggested for me by the organizers, and it was good that this title was suggested to me. So they suggested Elevating Underrepresented Communities in Physics as a title and as a guidance for what they wanted me to speak about. And why I really liked that suggestion is because I really hated that title. And it brought to mind for me this idea of, physics and, pulleys and, oh, we need to elevate, with the work that we're going to do on one end, we'll move these underrepresented communities up to where they can be, able to function in our broken culture. And so that also told me that I really needed to give this talk because I think we need to change the thinking around physics and around who's in physics. We need to be more equity minded in our thinking. We need to acknowledge that those numbers that I showed you, those inequities, those discrepancies of minority folks in doing physics, those didn't just come about, right? Those indicate that our practices and our policies are not working for everyone. And we need to take personal and institutional responsibility to really address and change the inequity that is in these physics spaces in order to change the numbers of people who, to change the makeup of the people who are able to participate. And so we need to eliminate the barriers that are keeping these folks from participating. And so I want to move on to demonstrating that in several spaces recently, there have been a lot of attempts and actions at informal institutional change, where individuals and groups of individuals are really taking it upon themselves to look at what they're doing in their own spaces and try to make changes. So I want to point out, this is obviously not comprehensive, but I want to point out that there are numbers of codes of conduct that are popping up in different collaboratory spaces. There are committees on inclusion that have come up to think about what's happening within different kinds of collaborations. You're starting to see more talks, even at science conferences around the kind of community we want and who we want to be involved in our community. We're looking at how we decide, how we gatekeep who can be in our spaces to study physics and to do this work, and how we need to change what we value and how we assess people in order to make those changes. And there are even several opportunities to think about diversity and inclusion and equity on the international side. And I just want to point out that this is not something that's only going on in the US. Other groups really are thinking about these concerns, who's involved in physics and who we want to be involved in physics. But as I mentioned, if we're going to get to true cultural change, then we really need to start thinking about formal institutional changes. And by that, I mean, we need to think about these areas of change that I outlined here. And for the rest of the talk, I'm really going to go a little bit deeper into these ideas of access, of policies, of incentives, and of leadership. So I'm going to start with access here. And I want to point out that much like Brian was already talking about, science leadership and policy making are often in the hands of very few people. And they're often in the hands of people who have very narrow perspective or who are thinking quite a bit alike. And those narrow groups of people who have had very similar experiences often underestimate the barriers to true inclusion that stymie good ideas and opportunities for larger numbers of folks to be involved. So I want to talk about this idea of axes of expertise and diversity. We're often good at, when we make up our committees or we make up who's going to give us input, even in our departments, we're good at thinking about things like scientific expertise and technical expertise, and maybe even people's affiliations with various projects that give them different kinds of scientific and technical expertise. And sometimes we want an outside perspective even, right? And so we'll find somebody who's not affiliated. But we're less good at thinking about these personal experiences in science and how they bring another kind of expertise to how we might think about making decisions and how we might think about providing resources and access for people. And so things like your institutional affiliation, if you're on a larger committee, are you at a small institution or a large institution? Those change the way you think about your ability to participate in science, your ability to get resources, your ability to have resources. Your career phase and your work status. Are you early in your career? Are you later in your career? Are you on soft money? All of these things influence how you understand this space of physics to be. And even your personal identity. If you're a Black woman working in a physics space, you have a very different perspective on the barriers and the difficulties than some other people who might not be Black or female. And so I put this quote on the slide that says, "I didn't know what I didn't know." And this is from Paula Stone Williams in her TED Talk, a transgender woman who talks about going through life in the space of being male or being perceived as male, and how when she transitioned, she didn't even realize what she didn't know about the difficulties that women were going through in society. And so if we don't ask these folks in our community to participate in talking about the barriers, then we're really unable to really understand and know what it is we don't know about the difficulties of working in this physics space. And so as we form our committees, we nearly need to keep in mind all of these axes of diversity and expertise. And so now I want to move to the idea of policies. We have policies and procedures. We're really good at making up policies and procedures for doing things, but we need to regularly monitor them, and we need to really assess them for their intended effectiveness. If we're trying to solve something with a policy or a procedure or an action, are we really addressing the issue and the concern that we have, and how do we know that we're addressing that concern? So I want to point out a couple of areas just as examples of places where policy and practice really need to be monitored for how well they support equity and diversity and inclusion in our physics space. And I'm going to concentrate on right here on bridge programs and dual anonymous review, because I think these are two places where people have put in programs that are solving a perceived problem, and while we might be doing them in a reasonable way, we really need to understand if we're doing them in the best way, because there are pros and there are cons to every policy and to every practice. And we need to recognize that, and we need to monitor those policies. So with bridge programs, and I'm not knocking either bridge programs or dual anonymous review, there are very good reasons for implementing these kinds of programs, these kinds of policies. But what we need to do is think about the implementation. So bridge programs can be really good at encouraging students who've had little background in physics to move into a space where they can think about being in physics as a career, as really moving into a space where it's an idea to be a physicist, because that doesn't come naturally to a lot of people. However, the cons are that if we do not implement these, if we don't implement a bridge program correctly, it can promote deficit-minded thinking. Again, this idea of, oh, we have to lift up these poor students who who have this deficit in order to get them into a space where we can support them. And again, that's a wrong-minded approach, and so we really need to focus on our implementation and regular assessment, really asking students. I have had many students who come to me with, Stockholm syndrome is the best way to describe it, who are like, oh, no one else would give me an opportunity, and these people were nice enough to give me an opportunity, and sure, I'm not being supported in the ways that I think would be really helpful, but thanks to them for giving me the opportunity. And we really have to get away from bridge programs that are not really helping our students in the ways that they need to be helped. Similarly, dual anonymous review has become very popular, and there are really good reasons for reviewing both proposals for telescope time and for funding. There are really good reasons to removing names of people from those proposals, so that you can better focus on the science of the proposal. Many of us have been in spaces where we're looking at a funding proposal or a proposal for observing time, where somebody in the room has said, well, these folks, yeah, they didn't write such a great proposal, but we know their science, they do good work. Let's just give them the money, or let's just give them the time. And if a proposal means something, if it means that you're communicating what science you're going to do, then it has to be there has to be a reasonable way to really help promote the communication of that science. And if we just remove names from proposals, then we can be in conflict with other reasons that we might want to promote particular kinds of science in our field. So I give the example of observing proposals, where at my institution, because we're a national observatory, we have a mission to really promote early career folks and thesis students to be able to do their thesis work. We have a mission to give time to folks at observatories, or at departments that don't have access to other observing opportunities. We have a mission to help promote science in those spaces. And if we just remove names, we're unable to fill those other science mission priorities. And so as we institute these different programs and these different ideas, which have a really good reason for happening, we really need to monitor how we're making those decisions and whether they're getting us to the places that we need to be to promote equity and inclusion in physics. The next thing I want to move to is incentives. This is the idea that, right now There's very little grant funding that's tied to progress on the metrics of inclusion of underrepresented or disenfranchised groups in physics, in doing science, in doing research. And this idea of broadening participation has in many spaces really come to be more about education and public outreach than about really bringing folks into our workforce and into participation in research. And so we really need to provide incentives for folks to do that, to think more about broadening participation as something that improves our workforce and our community. And so I have been pursuing this idea of producing a toolkit of inclusive practice. I've gotten some NSF funding to help the community to prepare for research inclusion as part of how they produce their proposals. So in the space where I'm working, this is telescope proposals, and the idea is that as people are putting in proposals to get lots of time on public facilities to do their research, we want to make how they're doing their research as much a part of the scientific merit as what research they're doing. And so I anticipate that when we tell people that we want you to include a program for how you're going to do your research and how you're going to be more inclusive in your research, they will tell me, I don't know how to do that. And so the idea of building this toolkit of inclusive practice came about, where right now we're surveying what's going on in the community, in our own spaces already, to put together examples of best practices and to comment on the efficacy of these practices and how you institute a practice in order to actually make it effective. And this includes the monitoring of different metrics, different things that you need to be looking at to know if the practices you've put in place are effective for promoting inclusion. And finally, we want people who are reviewing these plans for inclusive practice. We want the reviewers to really understand what makes a good proposal and where people are just giving lip service, but they haven't actually put in, as Brian was saying, those second order pieces to make this really work. So we want to give guidelines to reviewers for what they should be looking for in these proposals. And I've been able to actually hire a couple of research associates whose expertise is not in physics or astronomy, but their expertise is actually in policy development and in sociology to help me go through these different practices and think about go through what we're doing now and think about the best practices in a really informed way. And so we want to start tying rewards and metrics, rewards to metrics on inclusive practice. And in this space, rewards can be the opportunity to get telescope time or the opportunity to get funding. And so, as I said before, we want to value research inclusion, the inclusion of people in doing research as part of how we assess the scientific merit. And we're making how we do the science just as important as what kind of science we do. And just recently, NASA has instituted in their astrophysics theory program, and they are now requiring an inclusion criteria pilot program where folks putting in proposals really have to include an inclusion plan that will be evaluated as part of their proposal. So they're making steps towards just exactly this kind of thing that I've been talking about. And we really want to make sure that we hold people accountable, again, with consequences and rewards for really moving in this direction. And so finally, I want to talk about leadership. Discussions around inclusion in science are really challenging, and it's easy for folks at higher levels to shun them. we really need people. We need people who understand the importance of these issues. We need them in those high-level spaces to engage in this conversation for there to be traction. When I invited a high-level person to the Inclusive Astronomy meeting in 2015, he came to the meeting, but he came via remotely, broadcasting into the meeting, into the space. We all do it now, but then this was an in-person meeting, and when I saw him later, he said to me, "Oh, I would have made time to come in person if I had known that meeting would be so influential," right? And so, the idea that you have to already be seen as being influential in order for people to come to the space is problematic. And we really need our leadership to engage in these questions and engage in these conversations so that we can move them forward. And so we need a sustained and collective engagement with these ideas of changing our values, of moving our norms, and of adjusting our traditions. We need them from across the community. We need them in spaces that are grassroots, just as Brian was talking about. We need them in spaces of education, like in the Team Up report, where we're looking at doubling the number of African Americans receiving bachelor's degrees in physics over the next 5 years. We need to look at them in our spaces of our funding agencies. That inclusion is part of the mission success, alongside of things like integrity, alongside things like the science that you're doing. We need to look at our other funding agencies, other funding efforts. So the philanthropic organizations have really become important in the space of being able to help fund some of these efforts. We need to push those those philanthropic foundations and groups to really engage in this effort and really, again, think about making how we do physics as important as what kinds of physics we do. And finally, in the astronomy and astrophysics space, the decadal survey report will be coming out this year, and I'm really hoping that in this time we can do more with thinking about how we push, again, these second order ways of engaging equity and inclusion and diversity in physics and in astronomy. So we need all hands on deck to make.
Excuse me, Dara, you've got 2 minutes.
That's great. Last slide. We all hands on deck to make this happen. So I want you to think about what is the departmental and university culture where you are. What are the values, the norms, the traditions that you're promoting in your university, in your departments? Who has access? Who has the ability to give input? And where are the distribution of those resources going based on who's able to give access or who's able to give input? We want to look at your policies. You should look at your policies. Do they promote equity and inclusion? Are you monitoring those policies? Are you aware of how they are or are not affecting the change that you want to see? And are you providing incentives for doing the kind of equity-minded thinking and approach to building on inclusive behavior in your departments, in your spaces? Because we need your leadership. We need the leadership of all of us to help advance this culture change in our field. And so with that, I'll just say we must evolve physics to support our underrepresented communities in order for us to have a viable physics culture. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Dara. That was great, and lots of ideas for people to chew on. I encourage the audience to ask questions. There hasn't been any new questions, but people have been continuing to vote on the standing ones, and I think some of them will apply here too. One comment is being Black, gay, or woman in physics can be taxing, stressing, and full of time-consuming burdens. I've heard first-hand accounts of Black women physicists. They spend a lot of time advising people who uniquely relate to them. And I think that this is something we should all worry about, that the burden of addressing some of these issues is disproportionately impacting the people who are impacted by those issues in the first place. So do you have additional suggestions on how the rest of us can do better?
I do. I mean, I think that it really comes back to, again, this idea of thinking about how you're talking about these issues in your spaces. And I'm just going to put up this slide again, because I really do want people to think about their own situation, their own what's going on in their own departments. And so the only way that we're going to get away from this burden, this tax on folks who are already marginalized in our space, is to really really involve all of the community to be engaged in these issues, so that Black students don't feel like they have to go to a Black physicist to be seen, to be heard, to be to be affirmed in the fact that they are still Black and doing physics. And that is not, that's not something that's part of all of who they are. We're not there yet, and as we approach getting to there, I understand that there are burdens and there are taxes, there is struggle, but we have to start helping our community move in that direction. And yeah, does that mean, yes, it's going to be harder for us in the short term? Yes, but I think that if we don't start helping to move to those spaces, we will never get there. And again, how long do we have to wait? We need to bring people along. We need to bring people. We need to help our colleagues understand these issues and explore these issues. And it's all well and good to say that people should self-educate, but frankly, sometimes you don't want people to self-educate. You want them to actually engage with people who are experiencing some of these issues. You want them to ask some questions, because otherwise, they could easily come to the wrong, and I have seen this, they easily come to the wrong ideas if left to their own devices.
Awesome, thank you. And then another question is, dual anonymous review also seems very difficult to implement when large collaborations or highly specialized tools or skills are involved on the part of the proposer. Are there best practices for mitigating reviewer bias when the proposer's identity cannot be concealed?
Yeah, so this is an interesting thing about dual anonymous. The goal of dual anonymous is not to guarantee anonymity for the proposer. Sorry, that's not the goal. And in fact, in astronomy, because it is a small, a relatively small group of people, oftentimes people, will have insight into who's writing this proposal. The goal is to keep the conversation, the focus, the review of the science, right, and not of the team that's proposing that science. Now, sometimes, like I said, with other science mission goals, in fact, knowing who the team is actually important to assessing the scientific merit if we include scientific merit as being how you do the science, right? The ways that you're promoting equity and inclusion in how you do your science. So I advocate for a two-stage review. That is that in the first stage, it is a dual anonymous, where the proposal is anonymized, and that you don't know who's doing the proposing, so you can focus solely on the science, solely on what science is being proposed. And then in a second stage, you can take other information into account, where you think about what are the other values that we're trying to promote when we give out this money or when we give out this time.
Thank you. And there's one last question. Do you have any comments in AIP team in the AIP team up report for increasing belonging in department?
For increase, yeah, I think so. The team up report definitely talks a lot about increasing belonging. I think affirmation of someone's experience in physics is a really important way to increase belonging. I know that some years ago I was asked to write a little article about African Americans in astronomy, and what are the kinds of things that that we want or we need, or how we what would I like to see for us being in this space. And I wrote things that everybody wants to see. Everybody wants to have their ideas able to be discussed and affirmed, or they want to be treated with respect. They want to have equal opportunities to do research, to have resources. And so when I wrote this article, the person came back to me and said, "Oh, this is great, but it's not specific to African American researchers." And I said, no, it's not. Because at some level, we want to be researchers. We want to be researchers and be who we are. And those are the kinds of things that promote physics identity.
Great. Thank you very much, Dara. Again, that was fantastic. So finally, the last but not least is a talk by Geraldine Cochran on inclusive education practices.
All right, I'll start by saying thank you, Dr. McHenry, for moderating this session, and also thank you, Dr. Nord and Dr. Norman, for your presentations. So much of what you said resonated with what I have had on my heart and my mind this morning, and also what I'm going to talk about in this presentation. So I previously defined inclusion as all people, regardless of their social identities, having equal access to opportunity and advancement, receiving credit for their work, and being valued for more than just their membership in a social identity group. I've recently updated that a little bit to specifically talk about social, political, social, historical, and social cultural markers of difference. And I'll say that I usually start this slide with these workshops I give on inclusive classroom practices, where we talk about the literature and the research. And I'm a physics education researcher, so I talk about the research in physics education, and I have the audience work on some problems, some math and some physics problems, and I try to model the strategies that I say are effective in the classroom. And we even do case studies, and it's a lot of fun, right? But that's not what I want to do today. That's not even what I want to talk about today. What I really want to do today is elevate the conversations. I want to start with quoting Audre Lorde, who says, "Certainly there are very real differences between us of race, age, and sex, but it is not those differences between us that are separating us. It is rather our refusal to recognize those differences and to examine the distortions which result from our misnaming them and their effects on human behavior and expectation." And so I want to elevate the conversation in this way. I don't know that this applies in general settings, but Audre Lorde was speaking to feminists who are fighting for equality and sort of really only gender equality and ignoring race, right? This is what she talks about in this essay. And so I figured this session, those who attended, this audience, these are people who attended a session on creating inclusive communities in science. So this is the right time to have this conversation that I want to have. And I also want to acknowledge, I've listed here 8 students that I've been working with over the past year on a research study that is looking at how injustices and inequity impact student learning experiences. Particularly, we started this thinking about the transition to online instruction that happened last spring, in spring of 2020. Because going back to this definition I have of inclusion, like, one piece of this is equal access to opportunity and advancement. So we have to look at these injustices and these inequities, because if that exists, then it is not an inclusive classroom. It is not an inclusive education. So I'm going to start with one, which is economic injustice, right? So research shows that this impacts student performance, right? Results indicate that financially stressed students were more likely to be employed, worked longer hours, spent less time studying, right? Another study, greater financial burdens led to reduced time on coursework and may have caused students to drop out of school for employment. In some ways connected to economic injustice is access inequity, right? Students from lower income households may lack needed material resources to study, such as computers and access to internet connection. I'm gonna stop for a minute and tell a story. I'm gonna tell a couple stories during this presentation. Hopefully you can follow me. We will get back to this slide, but you know, this came up as a theme and my students were like, Dr. Cochran, we have to talk about internet access. That was like such a big thing last year. And so many students we interviewed, you know, they mentioned that this is a thing we have to talk about. And like, I don't know the literature on that. So I was like, okay, let me go look, see what is out there about internet access and who has it and who doesn't. And I came across this study that looked at internet usage broken down by race. And I didn't cite that study on here. I'm not going to cite that study, but I'm going to quote, right? I'm going to read directly from the study. They said, this is in their findings. For instance, in our sample, Blacks not only use the internet less, they also study less than members of other racial groups. While further research with a wider sample must be carried out in order to try to fully understand this connection, our findings echo previous research indicating that Black students are socialized to take their studies less seriously than white students. So these authors drew the conclusion that because Black students, that's what their data showed, that they were they spend less hours studying and they spend less hours on the internet. They drew the conclusion that they were socialized to not take their studies seriously. So they didn't think about, you know, economic injustice or any of the other things that I'll talk about today. That was the only conclusion that they drew based on that. And so as I was reading this, cited, okay, according to Google Scholar, cited 88 times, but as I'm reading this scholarly, cited, editor-reviewed garbage, I got so angry. I had to look up the author. Like, who is this first author that wrote this, right? Full professor in sociology. And as I'm looking up her profile, I noticed under her research interest, it said racial identity and inequality. I looked more into her page and I saw that this is someone that is actually promoting, right? Someone who's a champion of diversity, right, was said about her. And I was thinking, and yes, she wrote this, right? She somehow found the strength to fix her fingers to submit something like that. That is why I say these kinds of conversations, this is the right space. It's those who are actually striving for creating inclusive spaces and advancing diversity that need to have these conversations about what injustices and inequities are actually impacting student experiences. Because when they don't understand that, we see things like what I saw in this paper. But let me go back to access inequity. Right? Research also shows that students' life context also influence how they take up new technologies and learning, even when they have access, right? So that leads to environmental inequity, right? This is and there's less research on this, so I didn't cite anything on that, but this is situations where a student may be able to access remote instruction materials, but circumstances prevent the student from engaging in the ways that other students can. Examples of this: lack of a quiet space to study, attending to the needs of family members, or having unsupportive home lives, right? These things that impact students' experience, we have to realize, like, this is not the same for everyone. This is not equity, right? And so what do we expect from students in terms of performance? Then there's the impact of racial injustice. Again, thinking about the study that my students and I conducted, this was obviously, again, we're looking at spring of 2020, right? Last year, this was a major thing that came out, right? Something that students talked about. And again, very little research in this area, but I do cite Gersonson's work, which indicated that sustained exposure to a community-wide traumatic event reduced primary school students' math achievement. A police shooting in Missouri and the many months of civic unrest that followed had a negative impact on student achievement. So these things, right, they are actually impacting student performance, student experience in education. So if we're going to have inclusive education, we have to be willing to address this. And I'll just say that I mentioned, four things, right? There are a lot of things that came out, but this is definitely not an exhaustive list, but I just kind of want to use these to illustrate what I think needs to happen if we're going to truly have inclusive education. So I was very happy that, Dr. Nora talked about this a lot, but activism, first and foremost. I'm going to talk a little bit more about what I mean by activism and how we can engage in activism, but I'll also say some other suggestions, right? Become familiar with resources available to students through your instruction and through your institution, and local communities. I think back to when I realized that there were students in my classroom who were coming to class hungry, like actually coming to class hungry because they didn't have money to buy things on campus. And for some of them, they didn't have time to buy things on campus. And I was like, I even remember venting about this on Facebook. And then I was so embarrassed because my institution actually had a food pantry. There were other resources that were available, but I had never taken the time to actually look and find out what resources were available to my students. So this is one of the things that we can do. Also, advocating on our students' behalf to help them attain needed resources. I think about another case, a student was telling me, I asked him, how's, the beginning of the semester going? Because this student was no longer in my class, but, taking another class. And they're like, man, it's not going great. I don't have access to this online homework system and I don't have the money to pay for it. So I'm failing my homework. And I told the professor, and the professor's like, well, I guess until you have the money, you're going to fail your homework, fail all the homework assignments. That was the professor's response. So I asked the student, I'm like, what homework system is it? I contacted their representative from my university. I'm like, I have a student who needs access, having financial hardship right now. Can you help me figure out how to provide access? And they're like, is this your course? Which it was not. I was like, no. And they're like, okay, doesn't really matter. Here's a code. Give this to your student. They can use this to access the homework system for a full year. So it's like, not very difficult, right? But it's a very different response than, well, I guess you'll fail your homework assignments until you can figure out how to pay for it. Communicating your willingness to help students facing financial hardships early in the semester. Oftentimes it's difficult for students to talk about these things, and they're not even aware that there may be resources or that you as a faculty member could be a resource for them. So communicating this so that you can share those resources, and then doing our own homework so that we are aware of what resources are available to our students and how we might help them. What can we do about environmental inequity? Activism. It looks like I may have gone out for a second.
You're sounding fine if you're worried about that.
Okay, I was getting messages that it was unstable and my screen was just now being shared. Okay, but one of the things I put that in quotations, be patient, because that was one of the quotes that was pulled from the interviews that my students did. Oftentimes, this was the advice that the interviewees, which were students, were saying, we just wish the faculty would be patient. We wish our professors would be patient and be kind. Understand that students' personal lives impact their academic performance and implement practices and policies that reflect this understanding. Right? So maybe that means flexibility with deadlines. Maybe that means, especially in terms of not having access, say, to the internet, maybe that means providing alternative assignments for a particular student or putting the student on a different schedule. Again, another example, I think about a student who facing challenges at home was like, I need to deal with this. I gotta take a week and a half to 2 weeks off, but I don't want to leave school. I don't want to drop this class. I don't want to take it incomplete. I want to try to make it up. Prior to the pandemic, having conversations about this with colleagues and other faculty, it was unheard of. We can't do that. We have to have these standards and it has to be set. We have to maintain the quality and integrity of the course. We can't just let students be on a different schedule than everyone else. And now all of a sudden that conversation has changed and people are like, oh, we can do that. We need to be kind and we need to understand. And, if a student needs to take some time off, don't fail them automatically. See if you can let them make it up. If they need to do an incomplete, offer that, but see if they can finish it, before you're submitting grades, those kind of conversations. And, I'm happy to see that the conversation around these things have shifted and people are starting to understand the students' personal lives impact their academic performance. And so we need to offer some grace and we need to offer some flexibility in our policies. But I'm also angry because I saw many students from minoritized ethnic and racial backgrounds. I saw many students who are first generation college students who are asking their professors for these kind of accommodations and who did not get it prior to the pandemic. Racial injustice. What do we do about this? Activism. One of the things that students mention is just acknowledging that this is happening goes a long way. That's important for them. The other thing is having understanding that is reflected in classroom practices and policies again. And I have this under racial injustice, and I'm not even going to give examples of racialized violence. And thank you, Dr. Noor, for doing that in your presentation. I'm just going to give an trigger warning, one example related to gendered violence and sexual assault. Just this week, I was reading about in less than 1 minute, I was reading about Kristen Smart. And I remember the name stuck out because I try very hard not to read news things that come into my email, but the name stuck out because I remember when she went missing. And so I took some time and I read about these new discoveries in the case. And man, that hurt my heart. I could not, after that, respond to emails, create my students' homework assignments, start working on the final exam. I was done for a few hours, just not productive. And so we cannot pretend like our students are not reading these headlines, watching and seeing what's going on in the world and not being impacted by it, right? Like, that's just not reality. So how do we expect them to then do their homework assignment, go in to take an exam, participate in the classroom, right? That's not inclusive in education. Something I used to do is to offer a moment of silence in class for students to reflect on their feelings or share their feelings regarding these events when they would happen. So usually somewhere like 2 minutes or something, I was like, we're gonna have a moment of silence. Anybody want to discuss what they were thinking about and reflect on it? Did this in the physics classroom. But then I stopped. I stopped doing that. One reason is because the frequency with which these events are happening at this point, it's difficult to keep up and continue this practice. So I actually stopped. Another thing for those who do this is be equipped to share resources for counseling and mental health support offered by the college or university, as this activity might be triggering for some students. I think back to the way that I respond when I'm triggered by certain events. And so that also would not be fair to do that to students and then right before class and have them perform, especially if you don't have access to the resources or they can have access to resources to support them through it. So some people I know still do that. And I just say, use this with caution. Why activism? So again, I'm going to cite Audre Lorde. Audre Lorde says, but Black women and our children know the fabric of our lives is stitched with violence and with hatred, and there is no rest. We do not deal with it only on the picket lines or in dark midnight alleys or in the places where we dare to verbalize our resistance. For us, increasingly, violence weaves through the daily tissues of our living, in the supermarket, in the classroom, in the elevator, in the clinic, and the schoolyard, from the plumber, the baker, the saleswoman, the bus driver, the bank teller, the waitress who does not serve us. And this is what, again, Dr. Nora mentioned, like, for some of us, we don't get to turn this off, right? And again, I was thinking about, as Dr. Nora was talking about this timetable, right? It is not acceptable. It's not acceptable to be like, some people are experiencing trauma daily and it's just going to continue this way. It's not acceptable to say, despite the trauma that you're continually experiencing, we expect you to perform in these ways and that ways. It is not acceptable to say, well, maybe the next generation, or with our children's lifetime, or in the next 2 decades, or the next decade. It's not acceptable to say that anymore. Like, this has to change now. That is why activism is necessary, is important. If it wasn't, if our students weren't calling for us to commit to activism, they are. But even if they weren't, if the communities weren't calling for us all to engage in activism, they are. But even if they weren't, if our colleagues weren't calling for us to engage and commit to activism, can we not call on ourselves to do that? Can we not commit and say, like, there's injustice and inequity, and this is our responsibility? And I say that because there's this tension that exists between, that's not my field. This is someone else's work. There are activists. This is for people who are in the humanities. This is not for people who are in STEM or in physics. It is. It has to be. How to engage in activism. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this work from Salazar, Perez, and Williams. These two co-authors, these two women, they have worked together to engage in activism within New Orleans. One is an academic, Salazar. Perez is an academic, and Williams is an activist. And I really like this. I've been rereading this because it's creating a vision for me as I try to think about what am I doing? What role am I playing? Because I have to, I have to hold myself accountable also for the things that I'm doing, how I'm making a change, how I engage in activism. So I read this and it inspires me. One of the things that they say is they enmesh Black feminist thought and the local knowledges of communities of color to generate often inconspicuous strategies to dismantle and create spaces of resistance within oppressive conditions. And this connects to the environment, and education, and housing, and police corruption, and political corruption. And I said, like, I appreciate that because there are things that we can and need to do in education, and I'm going to give some examples of that in the next couple slides. But really, we have to be addressing and thinking about and engaging in activism related to all of these things, because all of these things impact our students' experiences in their lives. And if we truly want inclusive education, then that is what we're talking about. So they actually borrowed from Patricia Hill Collins' Domains of Power, right, from the Black Feminist Thought book. And so they use that as a framework for understanding the kind of activism that they engage in. So one thing is structural domains of power exist within social institutions. So this could be local government, this could be state or federal government, this could be our own, the institutions within with which we work, like our colleges and universities, right? Speaking out against, how do we address this? What forms of activism? Speaking out against oppression in public spaces within these institutions. Collective written statements, right? Engaging in activism in those ways. And these are things that have happened within the physics community, right? And we want to continue this because this is how we actually bring about changes in policy, those structures. So remember, like Dr. Nora was saying, like, it can't just be thinking about this individual just make this change, but really thinking about changing the structures and the system. Well, it's people's activism that actually can make these changes in the structures and the systems. Then there's disciplinary power, which upholds the oppressive circumstances even when structural power has been challenged and resisted. So, for example, the policy has been changed. There was a time when it was, colleges could give a rejection letter to a student and say they were not being admitted to this college or university based on their race or based on their gender. That is not allowed anymore, right? That structure has been challenged and resisted. That doesn't happen. But what if the policies and practices that are implemented within the university is still serving as a barrier to these specific people entering? I think about graduate education in physics. That would be an example of disciplinary power, still upholding the oppressive circumstance of keeping certain people outside of graduate education, preventing them from having access. How do we fight this with activism? Documenting violations of policy and continuing to push for change, engaging in research, showing how this is still upholding whatever the oppressive circumstances. Then there's hegemonic domains of power that can be described as ways in which the dominant replaces subjugated knowledge with their own specialized thought. So challenging what is acceptable as scholarly work. I think about the garbage paper that I mentioned earlier in this presentation. Research, merit, and who our stakeholders are. Recently, I was having a conversation with a friend of mine in PR, and we talked about some of the projects that we're funding. And I'm just like, who? Which reviewer approved this? I can't, it's funny, but it's even not funny as we talked about this particular project. Or sometimes, as both, Dr. Norman was talking about these funding agencies and the review process and what we're requiring of them, as Dr. Norman talked about, not offering funding to people who are engaged in explicitly racist behaviors, right? That too, that falls under this idea of how do we resist when it comes to these things. And then finally, resistance or empowerment within interpersonal oppression. So all of us have, right? All of us have privilege of some sort, right? We have some kind of privilege in some way. So, and it's often difficult to recognize our own privilege. So thinking about the matrix of power tied to our own positionality within particular social contexts. How do we engage in activism around that? Well, one thing is engaging in civil rights projects and activisms in relation to things that don't affect us personally, right? Being willing to learn and support communities rather than coming from a place of expertise or knowledge. And this sometimes is difficult, especially for people, who are scientists, scholars, academics, because we have expertise, but coming from a place where recognizing, this also sort of gets to this last one or to this previous one, right? About which knowledge is acknowledged and respected, but being willing to just listen and learn from other communities and understand and hear from them how we can be supportive. Using our privilege to support those marginalized and disadvantaged. And especially because, I was focused on faculty and education in this presentation, but as faculty members have power. They have a lot of power. How do we use this power to support our students, to mitigate the negative impacts of the injustices they face, and to also work toward addressing and removing those injustices? So in conclusion, I'm down with talking about, research-based curriculum materials that build on students' resources. I'm down with talking about classroom dynamics and how we, set up our classrooms and structure our classes to support student engagement and active learning. I'm down with talking about collaborative group work and what kind of assignments best fit collaborative group work, and how we facilitate group discussion so that the group work is helpful and not harmful. I'm really down with talking about alternative forms of assessment and mastery-based assessment and effort-based assessment and equity-oriented assessment. I'm really down with talking about all those things. But I'm down with talking about those things in discussion with people who've committed to activism, who've committed to acknowledging and addressing the injustices that impact teaching and learning experiences, because that is actually how we get to inclusive education. And I don't want to wait. I don't want to wait another year. I do not want another year like 2020 where these injustices and inequities were just highlighted and exacerbated by the global pandemic. And so with that, that is my piece. Thank you all for giving me this space to discuss this with you all. And thank you again, Dr. McHenry, for moderating and organizing this session.
Thank you, Dr. Cochran. That was really inspiring. Fantastic. So there's been some questions. You made the point, the great point that we should be aware of assistance available for students. Should universities require faculty to attend orientation sessions that educate them about what resources are available, since some aren't aware or willing to educate themselves?
Should it be mandatory for faculty? I guess that is the question. Since faculty aren't willing to educate themselves on these things, should it be mandatory for them to attend orientations or workshops where they learn about these resources for students? I should hope that faculty would be willing to do this, but I think as the person who posed the question said, they may not be willing to do so. I don't know that I would give a sort of blanket statement to say that this should be mandatory, as there are different structures at different institutions, some of which provide deans of students or people in positions similar to that have a much that tend to know much more about resources that are available to students. And so I don't know that I could say a particular orientation or workshop should be mandatory for faculty, but I think that information should be passed on to faculty. I think faculty should be encouraged to become familiar with the resources that are available for students and how they can connect students to the right resources, which might be connecting them to a dean of students or someone in that position, or it may be knowing about those things themselves. So yeah, I think that's my thoughts in a response to that question for now.
Okay, great, thanks. So I mean, I guess if I was paraphrasing, it's that even if it's not mandatory, the information should be made easily available to faculty, that it should be hard to not know this.
Yes,
and that would go some way to solving this. There's another question, and I'm going to paraphrase this a little bit. So the questioner asks, I appreciate the conversation on ways faculty can support their students. A challenge I have seen is not knowing what individual students need. How would you suggest overcoming this challenge? So I guess this question is related to how do you approach the conversation, or how do you have the right conversation that makes students be comfortable with sharing ways that you can help?
Okay. I think I have a few things to say in response to that. I'll also just go back to the previous question and say, I think it's important for faculty to have information about these resources in addition to students, because even if students have them in orientation, a lot of things are thrown to students, when they're going through orientation, and they may not remember these resources. So making it available, sort of readily available to faculty would be very helpful. How to encourage students. So I make an announcement at the beginning of class, and I'm like, if you are having, financial hardship, and it comes to having access to homework system, textbook, anything like that, feel free to reach out to me. I actually now contact the publishers beginning the class, and I'm like, how many, I need so many codes to access to the online textbook. I need so many codes for the homework system. And I have not had a problem yet. They have given me that every semester since. And so I tell students, like, if you need these things, then like, don't hesitate to reach out. We also have discussions about like, things happen during the semester. And I feel like, gosh, this past semester, I'm stumbling over what I'm saying. So having that conversation early in the semester and encouraging students to reach out to you, I think is important. The second thing is like being open about having these discussions about things that people typically do not think belong in a classroom. That was actually something that came out in our study, students might not even think it's appropriate to tell a professor that they're having financial difficulty. So having that conversation and letting them know, or that they're having a personal situation. And I always make it clear, you do not have to give me the specifics of any personal situation you're having, because I think putting that mandate on students to get support is also problematic. So just saying, if you have something going on and you're like, I need to take a week or two, or I need to shift, the calendar for myself in this class, then reach out to me. Let's talk about it. Right. So that is something I say early on in the semester, but also throughout the semester, like life, right? It just, I feel like this semester, I feel like I've connected. It's weird because even though we're online, I've connected with the students more now than maybe even in past semesters, because I brought so much of what I've gone through to the classroom. I think about, I had six, since January, 6 loved ones die, right? And that had an impact on me. And I didn't want to, sort of weigh this heaviness on my students, but like, I was like, I gotta tap out. I had to cancel class. I was like, I'm really grieving right now. And, I feel like having that discussion with my students has helped them to open up and talk to me. The other thing I would say is, once you've helped a few students with this, students are more likely to talk to each other. So a lot of times I'll get students who will be like, so-and-so said that I should talk to you, if I have this problem or, this thing. And so you will become known as someone who will be a resource to students when they're facing particular challenges.
Great, thank you. So we're out of time, but I would like to encourage everyone to go to the Join After Session networking. And I'd also like to express my thanks to our spectacular speakers. I think what we heard today was thoughtful, thought-provoking, inspiring, and I really learned a lot, and I imagine everybody else in the audience did too. So I really thank you very much for all the thought and effort that went into these excellent talks. Thanks.
Thank you.